The next speaker is Deb Zarin, but before we start, when trial registration began almost more than 10 years ago, it was a really good idea amongst ICMJE journal and journal editors, but we needed a mechanism to do it. And I think the person standing to my left is more responsible than any individual in the world for making sure that happened, and I think it should really be acknowledged that she's really spent a decade of her life ensuring that the reporting of clinical trials improves, and it's really a pleasure to have Deb here. The title of her presentation is Statements About Intent to Share IPD at ClinicalTrials.gov. Deb Zarin.
Thank you. Since you were so nice in that, can I ask to sit there? Because I can't, sure. I'm vertically challenged and I can't see the...
Go right ahead.
Thank you. This is awesome. Now I can see it. Sorry if I can't see people over there. So where's the clicker? How do I do this? Green goes forward. Okay, it's a good guess. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about what we've learned at ClinicalTrials.gov about sharing of IPD. This is just to give you a context for the data I'm going to present, and others have gone over this, so I'll just say that we collected data. I'm going to show you data from ClinicalTrials.gov between January of 2016 and just a few weeks ago in August. So this spans the time when the ICMJE proposed their policy, and it includes the time when they announced their policy as well. So, I should go back a second, sorry. So at ClinicalTrials.gov, in response to requests from the ICMJE, we added two data elements in December of 2015 that would allow people to say whether they had a plan to share IPD. So at the time of registration, or really any time, someone who was registering a clinical study could say yes, no, undecided about whether they plan to share participant level data. The data element has what we thought was a very clear definition of what was meant by IPD, and a clear definition of what was meant by sharing in terms of enabling a third party to use the data for research. So I'm going to be giving data about our experience with that particular question. We also added a question at the same time so that people who had finished where their trials had completed could say whether IPD or relevant study documents were available and insert the links. There's always been the ability to insert links, so we have links to Yoda from J&J, from Medtronic trials, have links to Yoda, we have links to BioLink, but this was providing a structure for the first time in ClinicalTrials.gov where you could put a link to your IPD. So these are the data. There much more detail about the study is in the abstract. And just look at the fact that this was an optional question in ClinicalTrials.gov, so there was no legal or other mandate to answer this question, and yet nearly 3/4 of the people who registered their study during that 20-month period answered it, which is kind of unheard of. We never get that many people answering a question that's optional, and it was maybe because we shaded the fact that it was optional, I'm not sure. So look at the row that says yes, and this is to emphasize that the two talks you just heard from were talking about a rarefied environment. Sarah talked about 3 leading medical journals and the people who had gotten their publications in those journals, and Joe talked about companies who had sought out the ability to use Yoda to share their data. And at ClinicalTrials.gov, you could think of this as the unwashed masses. So of the 25,000 trials that had answered this question, that responded to the question, 11% said yes, they do have a plan to share IPD at the end of their study. And 64% said no. This is overall. The careful readers in the audience will notice that those numbers are slightly worse than the numbers in the abstract. And that's because the additional 6 months of data that we have here, but don't have in the abstract, made the data a little bit worse. So it's not as if recently you're getting more yeses and fewer nos, you're in fact getting more nos and fewer yeses. So this is a sense of where things are at with the general clinical trial community as opposed to those who are publishing in the leading journals. Excuse me. And now, for those 11% who said yeses, we have evidence that many of them actually didn't know what they were saying. Because we asked for an option. Sorry, this is the world we live in. We asked for an optional question about, give us a description of your plan. We've since added more structure to that, but I'll get to that in a minute. So one person or one clinical trialist said through peer-reviewed publications. Another said that it'll be posted publicly on a clinical trial registry, which makes you think that they're not really talking about IPD in the same way we are. The emphasis in all scientific publications will be placed on the one-year endpoint, which is kind of neither here nor there. And then occasionally they said something that was very specific to IPD. So this gives us pause in terms of the level of education and knowledge and awareness in the clinical trial community. In terms of those during that 20-month period that have, again, optionally provided links to either IPD or to associated documents, we've gotten about over 100 trials have given us those links with about 212 different documents. 19 of those include links to the IPD data set. I will say that this is in the structured data element. We have many, probably a few hundred studies in there with links to IPD in their study record, like we have the links to YODA and the links to BioLink, et cetera. But of these 19, 12 had said that they weren't going to share IPD. So that's fair, though, because you can have a plan, not have a plan to share it, and then in the end share it. But it's sort of all over the place. I will add, however, that this is actually getting to be a reasonable resource for those researchers who want to find study documents, because this is growing. So the key findings from that little study are that there seems to be a lack of clarity about what constitutes IPD among the clinical research community. Again, not the research community who comes to this meeting or who publishes in the journals that are probably represented in this room, but the overall research community. Many organizations, I didn't present this data, it's described in the abstract. If you look by organization, many have no current IPD data sharing plans for any of their trials, including most of the industry. So people think, oh, industry is ahead of academia, and that's because there are some companies, more than some, many companies that have data sharing plans, but the vast majority don't have any data sharing plans, at least in terms of how they answer this question. Proposals for requiring IPD sharing will require widespread changes within the clinical research enterprise. And ClinicalTrials.gov could provide a centralized information scaffold, and this is a slide that many of you have seen where we're trying to encourage people to actually answer these optional data elements, not just because the ICMJE is now requiring them to do it, but because we think ClinicalTrials.gov provides a useful place to find this information about the clinical trials. So I have a few minutes. I'm going to just say a few other things. One is, some of you have seen this, but in terms of what is IPD, everything, this is a graphic that's supposed to show what happens to data from the time you collect it on the far left, the uncoded data like the case report form, all the way to when you analyze it and then report the summary data. So everything that's not shaded on the far right is technically IPD, but the value and the quality and the meaning of that data varies by where it is along that sort of journey. So think about what would be the IPD underlying the outcome of progression-free survival. So progression-free survival is a very common outcome measure. I forget what percentage of oncology studies in ClinicalTrials.gov have it as a primary, but it's a large percentage. It's frequently reported as here as the median progression-free survival with some range around it, in this case a confidence interval. So what would be the IPD underlying that? Well, it's hard to know because progression-free survival is time to event, the event being progression. So literally, do you just want the time for each participant, or do you want to understand what counted as progression, which could be 3 different things? It could be a change in tumor size of the original tumor, the index tumor. It could be another site, another lesion, or it could be death. And there's all sorts of detailed data that you would actually want for each of those things and what would be meaningful. There's ways of providing IPD, in other words, that wouldn't be particularly meaningful, and other ways of providing it that would be more meaningful. So I think, again, as a research community, we need to think about that. Then I'll just mention that a new change in ClinicalTrials.gov is as of 2 months ago, I think. We now allow for and in fact require the upload of the PDF of the protocol and statistical analysis plan at the time of results reporting in ClinicalTrials.gov, and allow it optionally any time earlier, including at registration. We also allow for the uploading of a PDF of the informed consent form, and we're very happy about these changes, and we are getting many of these documents, and this is another good place to find these documents if anyone wants to do meta research on these documents that previously have been somewhat hard to find. This is where you can find them in the bottom of the registry record under a section called Study Documents. And then finally, our plan is to add an advanced search option, a structured option to find studies that have either uploaded documents, like I just said, or links to IPD and links to the data set. So we encourage people to use these data for that. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Deb. Questions for Deb, Zarin, about her data that she just presented? She always has big, big numbers whenever she presents, like giant numbers. Okay. So, Deb, you have a somewhat different perspective than I think many people in this room. You've been at the registry for over a decade. It's been critical in improving the reporting of clinical trials. To educate a clinical trials community, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you think we need to do so that sharing of data becomes the norm and not the exception?
Let's see. Well, first I found it dismaying that 12 years after the ICMJE policy about trial registration was implemented, at the peer review Congress 12 years ago, it was just about to go into effect. That September 12th deadline was coming up. There was still some debate this morning about whether anyone should care about trial registration. So I think that we've published this pyramid where I think the trial registration is critical as the foundation for both transparency and ensuring or allowing for the integrity of the entire research enterprise. So focusing on trial registration as the foundation of the pyramid, and then summary results reporting, and I would say both in ClinicalTrials.gov and in a journal, and the journal allows for discussion and explanation and other things that sometimes border into what some might call spin, but sometimes don't. And then the IPD is the cherry on the top of that. So I think it's very important, but it's the most important thing is trial registration, then the summary results, then IPD. And the final thing I'd say is that we are finding, I don't know if they're islands or if they're whole continents of the clinical research community, and this will be shocking to many in this room, who don't even have protocols. Like there are portions of NIH-funded people doing clinical trials that do not have the scientific culture of having even a protocol. So I think that there's a whole promulgation of scientific standards that needs to go on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deb, and I want to thank each of the speakers, Sarah, Joe, and Deb Zarin, and I'm pleased to turn over the podium to Drummond Rennie. Thank you.